I love the Righteous Fire skill in Path of Exile, and often make 1 to 2 builds with it per league. I will be going over my most recent character, a life-based Juggernaut, at the end of the video, but first I'd like to break down step by step the building blocks for how you can build your own Righteous Fire character in Path of Exile. To begin with, looking at the gem description, let's break down each part. There's the purple outline, which basically is just giving a buff to other spells you use. It doesn't affect RF's damage itself, but often you can use it if you min-max some life regen and high max fire res in order to sustain Righteous Fire while using another skill. After that, I've highlighted in green all the lines that equate to how much base fire damage per second you deal to the enemies within the fire around you. These 3 items are summed together for a total amount of fire damage per second, variable based on your life and energy shield pools. So the higher your life or energy shield are, the higher total base damage per second you're going to be dealing with Righteous Fire. But RF has a catch, a big downside if you will. Highlighted in red, RF deals large amounts of damage to ourselves while it is active. It deals 90% of our life pool per second and 70% of our energy shield pool per second to us, meaning it would basically eliminate our own life pool within a second if we turned on this ability. Fortunately, this can be countered completely. Righteous Fire self-degen gets countered by 2 primary sources, fire resistance and percent life regeneration. I made a breakdown for how these 2 interact with RF's degen, which you'll notice 1% life regen is roughly a bit stronger than 1% max fire res, but you'll ultimately need a combination of these 2 things in multiple places to counteract the degen. This is the first thing you'll need to figure out, because without countering the degen, the build will be dead in the water if it defeats itself. If you're curious about where you can find these stats, I recommend checking out both the fire resistance and life regeneration Path of Exile wikis, for basically you'll have a list of various places you can get these stats. A big part of getting sustain and damage for Righteous Fire comes from your Ascendancy choice, of which in 3.10 I'd recommend Trickseter, Juggernaut, or Chieftain as the top choices here. I'd put Hierophant, Guardian, Ascendant, and Elementalist as second tier choices, while basically the rest of the Ascendancies I just wouldn't really recommend going there. Generally they're less than optimal by a fair margin in comparison to these. You'll notice that the top choices, Trickster, Juggernaut, Chieftain, they all have a lot of life sustain, and they have synergy with fire damage over time. So these are obviously the most important stats, so that makes sense that these would be the best ascendancies for us to use. Once we can sustain Righteous Fire, the next task is to min-max the damage of Righteous Fire. To start off, if you want to do damage, there are basically 2 Keystones which are 100% mandatory in my mind for Righteous Fire builds. It's Elemental Overload, which gives you 40% more elemental damage if you've crit in the last 8 seconds, and Elemental Equilibrium, which lowers enemies' resistance by 50% for the elements you did not hit them with most recently. This works with Righteous Fire because Righteous Fire is a degen, which means it doesn't count as a hit on an enemy, so you can be next to them, burning them with Righteous Fire, but then you drop something like Orb of Storms. That Orb of Storms hits them with lightning, lowering their fire resistance, and then you can deal way more damage with Righteous Fire because of this. Picture an enemy like Shaper, who has 50% fire resistance. If I'm dealing 100 damage per second to him, he negates 50 of that, but the second I drop an Orb of Storms and I hit him with lightning while having Elemental Equilibrium, it then lowers his resistance to 0, thus basically doubling my effective damage against Shaper. So that's why these Keystones are so important. They more than double your damage having both of them. Without them, you'd have a very subpar damage dealing with Righteous Fire. Often I recommend you proc both Elemental Overload and Elemental Equilibrium with the same spell. I'd recommend a Orb of Storm or Stormbrand. These spells both hit often and have a duration, and will thus proc your crit recently or crit in the last 8 seconds, as well as hit them with lightning damage, lowering their fire resistance. Next up, you'll notice that these Keystones are placed in between both the Witch and the Templar, meaning the tree will make you inevitably have to end up there, so keep that in mind when you're planning out your tree. To path there efficiently, going by nodes that you're going to be able to use along the way, like life, energy shield, fire damage over time multiplier, stuff like that. Keep that in mind when you're pathing out your tree. Then to improve damage further, you want to look for basically these are the main stats. Fire damage over time multiplier, regular damage over time multiplier, increased fire damage, increased damage over time, and increased life or energy shield, because the higher your life or energy shield pool, the higher base fire damage per second you're dealing. These are basically stats you want to prioritize on your gear as well. Aside from getting like capped resistances and life regen, you want damage, more or less. Another big stat for Righteous Fire is levels of gems to Righteous Fire, because it also gets flat fire damage per second based on levels. which you can pick levels to Righteous Fire. You can pick that up on weapon slots, as well as your amulet, or even local to the item you equip the Righteous Fire in. Like, say you put it in your helmet, and you have +1 to AoE gems, that would give you a level to your Righteous Fire in there. Now, another key setup I want to mention for self-sustain and survival is going to be with the Pantheon system. You want a combination of Ryslotha and Arakali. You'll see there's basically two key elements here that allow us to basically always have 70% life recovery rate whenever we need it. Because if we stop taking damage over time recently, according to Arakali's extra passive, or Pantheon notable there, we can get 70% life recovery rate. And we do this with our life flask with a remove burn life flask, which we can sustain the life flask with Ryslotha, and then whenever we need an extra boost of life recovery rate, we can quickly activate our life flask, thus deactivating our Righteous Fire, thus proccing 70% increased life recovery rate for the next 4 seconds, and then we can reactivate our Righteous Fire instantaneously, thus giving us 70% life recovery rate whenever we need it. I usually just use this in dangerous circumstances where I just got hit for a big amount of damage and I want to recover my life quickly. Last key point for damage I'd like to mention is the gem link setups. These are particularly confusing, or at least they were for me for a while, because there's only a select few supports that work with Righteous Fire, and those are Burning Damage Support, Elemental Focus, Concentrated Effect, Increased AoE, Efficacy, Inspiration, and Empower. Half of these supports are really kind of suboptimal. You'll notice that Efficacy only offers about 20% more damage over time, while Inspiration requires you to generate Inspiration charges with another skill to even get the damage out of that support. And then Empower is kind of variable whether or not it's a 30% more damage boost based on how much damage you're getting from your life and energy shield pools. Things like Swift Affliction you can't even use unless you have an Arcane Surge support linked to the skill, thus making it really suboptimal because you have one dead link just to use Swift Affliction. So keep this in mind when you're linking up your Righteous Fire, that there's a lot of things that don't work, and there's a lot of things that are only kind of suboptimal, but Righteous Fire can still deal a good amount of damage even with these suboptimal links. I believe I've covered kind of the key elements that are necessary for someone to really get started and get into building a Righteous Fire character. Now I'm going to go in game to basically go over my most recent Righteous Fire character, using it as an example to build off of, or copy it if you want for your first Righteous Fire character. And I hope you guys like it, and I'll see you in game. Now that we're in game, I'm going to kind of go over the gear real quickly and the gem links I used when I had this Righteous Fire character, as well as the passive tree, as well as the flasks. So to start off with, this was a life-based Juggernaut, so basically I was getting a bunch of things that had life on it for all my gear pieces. You'll notice I used a Calm's Heart, I used a helmet with life, I used boots with... Actually, these didn't have life, but they gave us bleed immunity. This may or may not be necessarily necessary, I just was doing it for the +1 endurance charge, but otherwise you could grab a Warlord pair of boots, I believe, and they can roll +1 endurance charges and then get life on those as well. I also had High Life Belt with an increased life recovery rate. This is a very important stat, either getting increased ES recovery rate if you're an ES character, or increased life recovery rate if you're a life character. It's basically a 20% more regen multiplier, and I would highly recommend it if you're building a Righteous Fire character. The belt slot is huge for grabbing this stat. Next up for my gloves, I have Fire Dot Multi. This is another huge stat for the build. You basically want life, Fire Dot Multi. If you're an ES character, you'd want high ES and Fire Dot Multi. Basically, that's how that works. With my amulet, I basically went for high life by getting a bunch of strength and a bunch of flat life. I bought this amulet for 10C, and then I crafted some resistance on it. You could also go for an amulet with plus the gem levels, or Fire Dot Multi can also be rolled on an amulet, but that'd be a more expensive version. And for my rings, I bought some Calm's Ways. These rings are super cheap. I bought them for like, I don't know, a couple C a pop, and then I bought the Prophecies for like 6C, and then upgraded them and I 20 quality'd them. These are great rings for life-based Righteous Fire, because you get a bunch of regen from endurance charges, and then you also become very tanky with endurance charges. You'll notice in the video I was basically tanking a lot of hits. That's because I built this character to be a very tanky RF character. And also I grabbed the Grey Spire Staff. I grabbed a very well rolled one for 3 chaos. No one cares about the staff. No one really uses it. But it's actually a decent staff to use because it gives us 4 to all maximum resistances that affects lightning, cold, fire, and chaos. And then it gives us a lot of increased global damage. This staff, at the end of the day, I more or less decided I'm not sure I'd want to use this in a Righteous Fire character. It worked well enough while I was using it, but I'm not sure I could recommend it. I think I'd rather recommend a Scepter Shield combo for being able to shield charge around maps. Is a much more fun playstyle for Righteous Fire, as well as you could even use a bow with a lot of fire dot multi and plus gem levels to get a lot more damage, I think, than you get out of this staff per se. And I have to give up a lot of gem links, so there's a lot of downsides, whereas there are other better upsides for other things. So although I liked using it and the character was very tanky and it worked well, this is something I'd only use on a budget if you're just trying to make a cheap budget tanky character. It works well for that, but otherwise I think there's other better options out there. Now, next up for the gem links, you'll notice basically, since I'm a life-based character, this is generally the setup you take. You grab a Calm's Heart as a life-based character, and then you grab a helmet that has multiple links. I grabbed this thing for 5 to 10C with burning damage and conk effect, and then I crafted life on it. You could also craft the only way you could get basically 30% more damage out of a life-based character is crafting Elder Helmets with an Essence of Horror, and you'd have to get lucky to get both of these supports on there. I actually had been trying to craft that very thing. You'll notice on, if I can remember where I put it, to be honest, I don't. Oh, here it is. Basically, I spent a bunch of currency. I spent about 60x crafting this helmet, and you'll see it has a 30% more elemental damage. Basically, I got triple T1 suffixes. I decided I would meta craft it some, and eventually I hit really high life on it, and I called it a day. This helmet was 60x. The funny thing is, with this helmet that was 10C, I'm dealing about 85% of the damage. So, that's 85% of the damage with this helmet, and I basically had another really expensive amulet that's now on another character. But with my 10C helmet, 10C amulet, I'm dealing basically 85-90% of the damage, and similar tankiness. The funny thing is, I did Uber Elder and Shaper Deathless with this setup, whereas when I had this setup on, I did Uber Elder and I died once. Probably just came down to me playing bad the first time, but the reality of the situation is this 60x helmet, the 30x, 40x amulet I had, they didn't make that big of a difference. No one really cares about a lot of Righteous Fire gear, so it's really cheap to get going and works out pretty well. But yeah, an upgrade from this would be getting burning damage, conk effect, and then the Essence of Horror, Socket of Gems deal 30% more elemental damage mod. So that's basically a common setup you do for life builds. You grab a Calm's Chest, and then you grab a 6-link helmet like this. Next up, I think that covers all of it. I was getting bleed immunity and endurance charge from here. I was getting life recovery rate from my belts, fire dot multi from the gloves, regen from the rings, and life from the amulet. For flasks, you want a basically the less charges you consume on your life flasks, the better. So a Colossal Life Flask is good for this. I think there's actually a couple other life flasks that might be better where they require even less charges. Because basically all that matters is how many times we can keep proccing this life flask to remove our burn from Righteous Fire whenever we need it. So more or less you want to look for low consummation of charges and then the remove mod for burning. That way whenever you're in a tight spot and you need 70% life recovery rate from your Aracali Pantheon, you can pop your life flask, remove the burn, get the regen, and you can put the Righteous Fire back on. You'll see this is how fast you can do it. I removed it, put it back on, was all good, you know, just like that. And then you have 70% recovery rate, which is basically almost doubling your life regen. Next up, I have a Sulfur Flask, just because you get more regen if you're staying on concentrated ground, as well as a Witchfire Brew, which basically allows us to deal more increased damage over time, as well as cursing enemies with despair. Because I was using this this staff here, I didn't have a lot of gem slots to have a curse on hit with my Orb of Storms, and because of that I needed to proc a curse somewhere else, and this was a great place to do it. Also, you can use a Rumi's Concoction for armor block, that's nice, and of course I always use a Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline for movement speed. I think this is mandatory for all my builds. I can't take not having the extra 70% movement speed. I also notice, since if you're doing a jug, I'd highly recommend this, but basically you need to proc your endurance charges by getting hit. Gluttony of Elements has this mod where it says take physical damage when you use a movement skill. So whenever we use a movement skill, it'll proc the mod where we get hit, and that'll generate endurance charges. You'll notice now I have 10 endurance charges. Basically, whenever you're in a boss fight where they have long dialogues or they have invulnerability phases, you just want to belt swap to this flame dash or whatever your movement skill is once, and get the endurance charges up. That's just if you're using a Jugg, because Jugg has a node that says gain 1 endurance charge every second if you've been hit recently. So it's basically equivalent to gaining 4 endurance charges, but often, because not Guardian, Juggernaut also has 25% chance that if you would gain endurance charges, you instead gain the maximum number. Meaning that more than likely, if you get hit once by the Potion Flask, you'll go up to about your maximum endurance charges, more or less. So now that we've gone over the gear, the potions, kind of what we're using here, let's go over the passive tree. Now, first off, I want to say this is relative confidence. I believe Divine Flesh is really the way to go if you're going a life-based Righteous Fire character. The reason for this is, one, it makes the need for max fire res a whole lot less. You'll notice in that chart I showed earlier, I had a list of the percentages you need with Divine Flesh, and just off the top, if you have 75 fire res, it was like 7% less regen you need. And on top of that, Divine Flesh also makes you tankier against cold, lightning, and even fire damage hits with penetration. So if you have like an Ziri's Flame Blast, for example, which does fire pen, you mitigate that fire pen for 50% of the damage because it gets taken over to chaos damage and it can't penetrate that chaos resistance, more or less. So for Divine Flesh is basically an ability where it makes your max chaos res go up to 85, and then you can get that up to 90 with either Cluster Jewel Notables, which is probably the way I'd recommend doing it, or items like this that say plus to all maximum resistances. You'll see I have +4 from the staff, plus from one with my chest, making my max chaos res go from 85 to 90. I'd recommend going the route of getting the Notables with max chaos res. That would make it so you don't need much chaos res on your gear. I had to get chaos res kind of all over the place. You'll see I have 50 on my belt alone. I get 40 from Juggernaut. If I just use some of those Notables over here, that would solve my chaos res issue as well as making it so I don't need max res on my chest and my staff per se. So definitely look into that. But Divine Flesh, I think, is a great way to go with Righteous Fire. It makes the degen a whole lot less harder to counter, along with also making you a lot more tanky for cold and lightning damage on top of that. Next up, you'll see I grab Elemental Overload, I grab Elemental Equilibrium. You cannot get around this if you're building a Righteous Fire character. In my mind, it's mandatory. It like more than doubles your damage between the two of these things. So in some way, shape, or form, you need to end up on this side of the tree. And that's, in my mind, somewhat non-negotiable. Aside from that, you'll notice I use some Cluster Jewels in this build as well. Ideally, you'd want Medium Jewels with Wrapped in Flame and Burning Bright. This is actually a pretty rare outcome. I crafted 2 of them. I got pretty lucky while crafting them, but even without getting lucky crafting them, you can craft some decent jewels for relatively cheap. I crafted some Wrapped in Flame, Flow and Life jewels pretty easily. And the way you do this, basically, is crafting medium fired out multi-jewels with pristine fossils. This gives you a much higher chance to get Wrapped in Flame, as well as a much higher chance to get Flow of Life, because those are both life modifiers, with the small chance you get something cool like Burning Bright with your Wrapped in Flame. And ideally, you'd want it with a jewel socket. Without a jewel socket is okay, but at the end of the day, you'd probably want the one point jewel socket. For my large jewels, all I cared about was getting Burning Bright on the travel node. I just outscoured these until I got Burning Bright and 2 jewel sockets. I got 3 Notables on one, which was just lucky, but ultimately didn't matter too much. It was the difference in like 13% increased damage, which isn't the end of the world. And then you'll see on my other one, I just have the Burning Bright on the travel node. So that's what I'd recommend for Cluster Jewels. For the most part, if you're doing a Righteous Fire character, I'd recommend at least 2 of these large plus 4 medium setups wherever you're doing it. If you're doing an ES character where you're over here on this side of the tree, still grab a cluster here and a cluster here. Stuff like that is what I would recommend. Other than that, I'm basically just grabbing life all over the tree. I'm anointing and grabbing all the endurance charges. And yeah, that's basically it. On top of that, I chose to do Juggernaut. I wanted to be super tanky. So with Juggernaut, with 10 endurance charges and some armor for my gear, I have basically 90 Fizz reduction, which means Fizz doesn't really hurt me. And then on top of that, I have a bunch of chaos resistance and additional phys reduction from Juggernaut, as well as reduced elemental damage taken, and just straight up reduced damage taken. So the Juggernaut ended up being quite tanky. You'll notice I tried to highlight me absorbing explosions. I'd say if you want to go for ultimate tank version of Righteous Fire, Juggernaut's the play. If you want to go for higher damage, I'd recommend Trickster or Chieftain. Outside of that, there are some niche cases where you'd use the other Ascendancies I recommend, but Juggernaut is great for area of effect. I'm getting 60% AoE just from Juggernaut alone. You'll notice, well, I can't do it with this helmet because I have Conk Effect, but if I took this out and I grabbed Righteous Fire and I threw it in here, you know, it's a pretty big AoE right there to begin with. I don't have fire resistance now because this one had fire resistance on my helmet, but basically, you know, it's a pretty good AoE. If I put increased AoE on top of that, as well as using Val Righteous Fire, you cover a large part of the screen. It feels great. So that's one of the great nice things about Juggernaut. If you're using another Ascendancy, you gotta grab your area of effect somewhere else, like grabbing Amplify, like grabbing Blast Radius, grabbing some area of effect, Cluster Jewel stuff. That's what you gotta look at. Otherwise, that's the gist of the character. I hope you guys like this one. Hopefully it was somewhat helpful to give you a good idea, basically all the basics on what you should do when you're building a Righteous Fire character. I'll leave a POB in for this character in the description, so that way you have something like as an example to work off of, but feel free to make your own thing. Don't necessarily feel like you have to follow this character per se. That's all. I hope you guys like it. I'm kind of dying down as the league's going towards the end, but I'm hoping they start releasing news for the new league so I can get hyped up again about playing some PoE. I'll see you guys later.